Welcome back to our third session of the study of the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Light and Life. And today we're going to talk about the I am sayings of Jesus found throughout the Gospel of John. There are 7 of them, and they all point towards it. We find Jesus saying, I am, and then he offers us a metaphor that's drawn from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, typically of something that is related to God, how God works in the world, or what God has done in the world. And then he relates those things to himself. All of these are ways for us to answer the question, how does Jesus give life to us today? But before we do that, I want to take us back to Exodus chapter 3. And actually in the beginning of the book of Exodus, we find that the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and God has heard the cries of the people, and he has called Moses to go back to Egypt and to lead the people from slavery to freedom. So it's in the wilderness. There's a burning bush. Most of us know the story. Moses comes to the bush. He hears the voice of God saying, I'm going to send you back to Egypt. And then Moses asks this question, well, when the Israelites ask me, who is it who sent me? Who will I say has sent me? And this is God's response. Moses is looking for God's name. He lives in a polytheistic culture. Which of the gods is sending me? And God says to Moses, I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent me. This is a really interesting name for God. What is your name? My name is I am. We know in Hebrew, Yahweh is the word which we can't really fully even translate. It's some version or something to do with the verb to be. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, but an unusual name for God. Here's what I think God was revealing to Moses in that word, in that holy name, is I am existence itself. I am life itself. I am being itself. Everything else that exists is contingent upon me. It only exists because I am. At the root of everything else, I am. And when you finally get that, you realize what a powerful and holy name this is. That God says, I am, and because I am, you are. And so when we think of this word, and of course this word became so holy that the Jewish people by the time of Jesus wouldn't even pronounce the name Yahweh. They would only say Hashem, the name. Or they might transfer when they'd read Yahweh in the text, they would say Adonai. And today we know these words Yahweh. We also recognize Jehovah as a way that probably a mispronunciation of what Yahweh was. But when we see those words, we understand this is the divine name, the tetragrammaton, the name of God. So in any case, in the Gospel of John, which has the highest Christology of all the Gospels, when we talk about a Christology, we talk about a low Christology, meaning that it really reflects the humanity of Jesus and him teaching us and showing us the way we're meant to live. But a high Christology is one that really identifies Jesus with the Father. And so we find this throughout the Gospel. We find this in particular in these I am sayings. So when we come to the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, we find Jesus is speaking to the religious leaders, and he says, your father Abraham was overjoyed to see my day. He saw it and was happy. And they said to him, you aren't even 50 years old. What do you mean Abraham saw your day? And then he says this, I assure you, before Abraham was, I am. And they went to pick up stones to stone him, right? Now, they weren't stoning him simply because he was claiming to have been around in the time of Abraham. They were going to stone him because he had used this name and somehow identified himself with the I am, with the source of life itself. And we find this in several other places in John's Gospel. We find in John chapter 8, verse 28, Jesus says, when the human one, or the Son of Man, is lifted up, you will know that I am. And there's a couple of other places where we find this kind of reference. Now, in the I am sayings of Jesus, Jesus actually provides the metaphor that follows. And so, one might not necessarily pick up this if you didn't recognize, the other statements where Jesus says I am. But in the 7 I am statements, Jesus says something that is helping us understand who he is and how he gives life. So these are the 7. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. In each of these, he's helping us understand something about who he is. And we're going to take 2 of them and unpack them here just briefly. The first of those I want to ponder with you is the idea of Jesus as the bread of life. When you think about the bread of life and Jesus' statement, I am the bread of life, part of what you're meant to notice is the context in which this story happens. So Jesus says this after he's fed the multitudes. The only miracle that appears in all 4 Gospels, as we noted before, is the feeding of the multitudes. So Jesus takes the few loaves of bread, the couple of fish, and he multiplies them, feeds the multitudes. And then it's after that, in response to this, that Jesus gives us this great claim, I am the bread of life. Now, when he's done this, he's trying to teach us again something about what he provides. And some of what we want to recognize is the important role that bread plays in the Hebrew Bible and in the story of God's people. And in particular, the central saving act of God in the Hebrew Bible is God's deliverance of the slaves from Egypt to freedom and the Promised Land. And you'll recall that at the last, what happened just before the release was the plagues. And when you get to the final plague, you find it's the death of the firstborn. And the angel of death is going to pass through the land. The firstborn in Egypt is going to die. The children of Israel are to slay a lamb, take the blood of the lamb and put it on their doorposts, and the angel of death will pass over them. And then they're meant to leave in a hurry. They have to leave quickly. And so there's no time for their bread to leaven, and so they bake unleavened loaves, and then they flee. And from that time on, the way they remember God's deliverance of them from slavery in Egypt is by breaking unleavened bread and eating it in the Passover Seder. And if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, I've been to several with my rabbi friends, it's a fun occasion. It doesn't happen in the synagogue, it happens in the home. And there's things for the children to do, and it's a happy occasion, but it's also a very dramatic occasion in which you're dramatizing, you're reliving God's deliverance of your people. One of my rabbi friends said, Adam, you've got to get this story if you're a Jew. It is our defining story. And that defining story is acted out with bread and with wine, actually. And so Jesus, when he's talking about I am the bread of life, they can't help but think about the Passover. And John gives us a clue. He says this happened about the time of the Passover feast. And so he's making sure that you get this in the timing and this little detail he gives. So we understand the Passover meal and the Passover unleavened bread was really important, God's central saving act. And what this is pointing to is the transformation that Jesus makes to the Passover Seder in the Eucharist, right? And again, John's not going to come out and say that quite so clearly, although he hints at it again, because when Jesus takes the bread to feed the multitudes, he takes the bread, he gives thanks, and he breaks it. And the Greek word, is the basis of our word Eucharist. He gives thanks. And so John's trying to give us all these clues to help us see what's going on here in John chapter 6. Well, in any case, there's another form of bread that the Israelite people would have clearly recognized, the Jewish people would have recognized, and that is the manna that was given from heaven. And so while the children of Israel are passing through the wilderness, every morning they wake up and there's this manna and it sustains them. Without it, they cannot live. And so they come to Jesus, and as they're talking about bread, they get in this conversation about manna and the manna from heaven. And Jesus once more says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread that comes down from heaven. And he's saying, I am the source of your very life. Bread was the stuff of life. It was the staff of life, is the phrase. And without it, nobody could live. Every meal contained bread and wine, or bread and water, but you had to have bread to live. And so, again, Jesus is pointing us towards something essential. He's saying, in me you find life. There's a whole lot of ways that we can really look at this and unpack it. I think about the idea of breaking bread. And so many of Jesus' of his ministry encounters happen over a meal, right? And he breaks bread with people. And you may remember the Latin word for breaking bread is companere, from which we have our word companion. One becomes a companion when you break bread, pan. When you break bread with somebody else, you become their companion. And so Jesus comes as the bread of life from God. He's offering life, and he becomes our companion. And I love that imagery in the Eucharist. When we eat the Eucharist together, we're not only bound together with one another, but we're bound together with Christ, being companions on this similar journey, on this journey of following Jesus. Now, I was thinking about this, and some time ago I had a chance to visit with a baker, and I went to look to see the bread that he was making, and as we were talking, he says, I just can't stand that white bread, the stuff that you can squish it up into a ball and throw it at somebody. He says, that's just not bread. He says, bread is meant to have holes in it. It's meant to have texture. You can smell it. It's made of the finest ingredients. And as he was describing, his excitement about bread and his passion about bread, all I could think of was how Jesus is the bread that gives real life. And when we think today, bread often, at least starting in my generation in the 70s, you talk about bread was a synonym for money, right? And you think about the things that we settle for when it comes to the bread that we eat, the things that matter to us, where we think we find life. And I think for us today, this text is still saying to us, look, if you really want to find the good stuff, you want to find life, it's in Christ. And what I love about the Eucharist is it gives us a chance to tangibly participate in that story, our central saving story as Christians. And we participate in it by eating the bread and the wine, and we become his companions in the journey of tasting and feasting. Now, one of the other I am sayings that I thought it might be interesting to talk about for a moment is when Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And what's interesting here is, again, John is giving us clues. He says that this happens during the Feast of Booths. right, during the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, this is a fall feast to celebrate the harvest, but it's also during this feast that people build their tabernacles, their tents. The Jewish people still do this to this day in their backyard. And when they build these tents, they're remembering that they sojourned in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, in the wilderness, God led the children of Israel how? You remember? It was by a column of clouds during the day and a pillar of fire by night. A pillar of fire by night. And in Jesus' day, in the temple, they celebrated this festival they had 4 huge lampstands. They were 75 feet tall. And at the top, there were 4 bowls on each of them. They were filled with oil, and the priests would take their undergarments, they would turn them into wicks. They would roll them up, and so you had all of these wicks tapping into the oil, and they would light them aflame. And in the temple, it was lit up, which, of course, in the days before electricity, to see this kind of light coming from the temple was a reminder that the glory of God had led them. So what's happening here when Jesus says, at the Festival of Booths, in the place where it was likely in the court of the women where Jesus is telling the story, where they lit those candle stands, like you could see them while he's talking. And he says, I am the light of the world. What is he saying? You know, that God has become flesh, the Word has become flesh to show us the way, to dispel the darkness. All the things we talked about when we talked about the way on Christmas Eve, we recognize the darkness and we come into the light. And our eyes are opened and we see and we finally understand, and he leads us and he guides us and he helps us not to be afraid, and he disperses the darkness. And that, I think, again, is what Christ is calling us to be for other people, to convey the bread of life, to convey the light of the world. We find that in him. We share that with other people. Are there any questions that you all have?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
We have talked about light and life and water and wine, and obviously the metaphor for bread. What is the significance of bread throughout the Bible?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In addition to the Passover Seder and the unleavened bread, which was God's sign given for the children of Israel to remember this forever, and of course the manna in the wilderness wandering, we find that God commanded that there be bread offered to God on the altar, and so it was called the shewbread, or showbread, some people say, and so this bread was an offering of the people on behalf of God. We also find a reminder, human beings don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So we have this text in the Hebrew Bible, and then we find the beginning of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh. You shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So again, you find all of these interesting connections. You find Abraham, who has an encounter with Melchizedek, who is the priest of Salem. And Melchizedek brings out bread and wine. This mysterious priest brings out bread and wine, and it's broken there, and they share. So there's a sense of this divine mystery caught up in this meal. And there's a whole host of other ways in which you find bread in the Hebrew Bible pointing towards what Jesus does, or what he brings, or who he is. So great question, and I'll leave it to you to discover all of those other things. But if you do a search in your Bible of bread and look in the Hebrew Bible, you're going to find there's connections there with Jesus at multiple points.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think it meant to the Jewish leaders and scholars when Jesus claimed, I am?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think when Jesus claimed I am, some of them instantly saw that as blasphemous, which is why some went to take the stones and wanted to kill him. Some may not have quite picked up on it. When you just hear Jesus say, I am the bread of life, or something else, well, that would have, you could say that in the Aramaic tongue without it signifying Yahweh. It was the to be verb, but you had to use that verb in daily life. But I think when he makes those statements like, before Abraham was, I am, it became clear that Jesus is making some kind of claim to participating in the divine life. I don't know that they fully have this concept of the Trinity. I know they don't have this concept of the Trinity, or that Jesus is claiming that, but that certainly he's claiming in some way he is God, or God's presence in their midst. And so I think that's how they would have heard that. Another interesting question is, in what ways did Jesus actually say these things? Or in other words, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we don't find this very often. We find maybe a couple of references to Jesus using I am in this sense. But the I am sayings we don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so it's possible that Jesus said these exactly like you find them here, or it's also possible that John wants to make sure that you get who Jesus is. And so, again, if you're reading John and you're looking for the actual words of Jesus, you're reading it in the wrong way. You're meant to be reading it and hearing that when John is speaking, and Jesus is speaking in John, he's trying to make sure you get it. That after a lifetime of studying Jesus, John wants to make sure this is who he is. I don't want you to miss this. He's not nearly so concerned about, well, did Jesus exactly say it this way or that way? It's more making sure that you understand the message. And this is why in the early church they considered John the spiritual gospel. That was the phrasing that they used of it. This was the spiritual gospel. You weren't reading it so much as the exact words of Jesus. You were reading it to see what is the exact meaning of Jesus in our lives. Any other questions? All right, well, as I think about these two things, I think about the picture of light and darkness in the Hebrew Bible, and I'm reminded of this passage in Psalm 139. The psalmist says, "If I said the darkness will definitely hide me, the light will become night around me, even the darkness isn't too dark for you. Nighttime would shine bright as day because darkness is the same as light to you." And elsewhere the psalmist writes, "You wear light like a robe." And this picture in my own life, who I am and how I see the world and how I face really dark situations is different because I see Christ as the light of the world. And interestingly enough, Jesus says in John's gospel, "I'm the light of the world." In the synoptic gospels, he says, "Now you are the light of the world." And so those of us who have come to see the light of Christ are meant to carry that light into the world. A city set upon a hill that cannot be hidden. Let your light so shine before others that they might see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So when we come back next week, we're going to turn to the farewell discourse of Jesus, which in John's gospel encompasses much of the gospel. 40% of the gospel is that last night of Jesus' life and then what happens after that. And we're going to look to see what Jesus said to his disciples, those urgent things that he said just before his death. And that'll prepare us to consider the meaning of Christ's death. Look forward to seeing you next week.